people, they want everything now. If you tell them something for later, I ain't got no time for later, I want it now. Capitalism makes you think that everything must come now. But the struggle in which you're involved in is the struggle in which you will not reap that which you've sown. You have already reaped that which has been sown by past generations. You must sow for future generations to reap. I'm so tired of brothers and sisters coming and saying, when we going to enjoy the good life? It ain't for you, it's for the next generation. Do your work now for the next generation. When you work for your people, it is not what you receive, it's what you give. And the best thing about working for the people is that what you really give for the people, sometimes nobody else knows except you. This is real struggle for the people. This is real struggle for the people. Thus, we must wipe out from our minds that the struggle in which we're involved in is going to give us any victories. The struggle in which we're involved in is an eternal struggle. We are not working for ourselves. We are working for generations to come. Therefore, what I've done, you ain't even begin to see. Generations later will come to thank us for the work we've done now.
Semuga no moya inkomo zobaba semuka nomoya wasiyolobola ngani na wasiyele inkomo zobaba semuka nomoya wasiyolobola ngani na wasiyele inkomo zobaba semuka nomoya ilanganishanile bafana masizuyisa inkomo zobaba ilanganishanile bafana masizuyisa inkomo zobaba atilanganishanile bafana masizuyisa inkomo zobaba ilanganishanile
Warmest greetings, sisters and brothers, and welcome to the Pan-African People's Phone-In. The Pan-African People's Phone-In is a space for themed interactive study conducted in cyberspace. The studies, whether they're historical or contemporary, impact on African people both locally and globally. The Pan-African People's Phone-In from time to time has guests, particularly guests from revolutionary Pan-Africanist organizations. But occasionally there'll be others, non-African guests included, and they'll be invited to come in and contribute. Now, the activities of all guests will be examined on the basis of their relevance to African people. Interviews and presentations will set the scene for a more general discussion in the second half of the program, where listeners will be invited to phone in, ask questions, and contribute. We ask that you spread the word. Please tell all of your family, friends, fellow organization members, colleagues, associates, and other networks about the show. Message your friends right now. Let them know that the program is happening. Encourage them to listen every Monday from 8 p.m. until 10 p.m. And we're talking about the time in Britain when I give out those times. I know that we have listeners in other parts of the world who will have a different time frame to the one I've just mentioned. But in terms of the time here in Britain, it's 8 p.m. until 10 p.m. every Monday. Now, I want to say a warm greetings to the whole of the network, really, surrounding the program. That network includes people who listen. I know that there are people who aspire to listen, but haven't yet made the connection. So I'm wishing warm greetings to you, whether you've actually made the connection or still trying to make the connection. I'm wishing a warm greetings to our engineers who silently in the background work to ensure that we're up to technical speed and able to broadcast over the internet. I want to say a warm greetings to the station's management for all the work that they do behind the scenes to ensure that the operation is well oiled in the way that it moves forward to serve our people. And of course, I want to say a warm welcome and greetings to my fellow presenters here on Blessed Radio. Now, we've got to remember that it is the collective coming together, it's the presenters coming together that allows us to have a structure of programming that's more meaningful for people who are at the listening end, for you who listen to the station. So I just want to say a big greetings to all of our network of people, all of our family of people who listen in to the Pan-African People's Phone-In. Now, there is no studio phone today. I suppose we're not greatly perturbed by that, because we will be, working our way through the Garvey literature today. But I will endeavour to get a number that you can ring should you decide that you want to participate in the programme today. So I'll give out the number a little bit later. But what I'll do in the interim is just remind sisters and brothers of where we are, or what it is that we're doing in the program today. Now, we are studying from a book entitled Pan-Africanism from Program to Philosophy. That's the book that we're actually working with. An Outlook on Liberation is the subtitle. So Pan-Africanism from Program to Philosophy. Let me say that is the first in a series of books on Pan-Africanism. So it's the first of a series. It's a book that I've written. I've written 3 books which are entitled the Pan-African Series. The first 2 have been published. So the one that we're working with today is called Pan-Africanism from Program to Philosophy. An Outlook on Liberation is the subtitle. That's the first one. Part 2 in the Pan-African series is entitled Pan-Africanism, the Battlefront. And the third in the series, let me just say that the book 1 and book 2 are generally available if people are looking for them. So you can get, book 1 in the Pan-African series and book 2 in the Pan-African series. You can get those books readily from, if you want to go online, you can get them online, etc. Our own Lady Leo here has copies. Sister Ligette in the community also has copies locally. We have people in Birmingham who have copies. People in Nottingham who have copies, and we're generally building up a network where people will be able to get hold of those books. But on the third in the series, that's the Pan-African series, is called Pan-Africanism, Material-Based Concepts. I'm expecting that to be published online between today and the next program. So sometime in the next 7 days. It's my expectation that the third in the series will be published. We'll go through all 3 of them on air so that people can actually study the books through this process if they so choose. It's easier, of course, to engage in the study if you actually have the book available to you. But anyway, so we're working from number 1, part 1 in the Pan-Africanism series. Pan-Africanism, the title is Pan-Africanism from Program to Philosophy. We've reached chapter 2, and we are looking at Marcus Garvey, the strategy of Marcus Garvey and the UNIA is what we're actually focusing on. Maybe I'll talk a little bit more about the strategy in a little while. But just let me give an overview of the actual book. So the overview of the book, as written on the book, is Pan-Africanism from Program to Philosophy is the only book in the world to provide clear, lucid and simple explanations of the liberation strategies of Marcus Garvey, Kwame Nkrumah and Malcolm X. Historians have been naturally concerned with reporting the facts of the lives of these great Pan-Africanists, but it is for activists to contextualize them in liberation strategies and action plans, a process kick-started in it. In addition, it provides a clear, succinct explanation of international capitalism's parasitical dependence upon African people. It provides a clear and simple explanation of scientific socialism, relating it to African principles and culture. It introduces the notion of a greater cycle of revolution which examines and locates revolution not as an incident, but as a process in the context of the entirety of human history. Through an examination of universal principles, it locates the material base of the two opposing sets of ideologies driving human activity and identifies the natural position of African culture in that milieu. And finally, through a newly devised network of dialectical tools, it provides a powerfully clear philosophical analysis of matter as a basis for uncovering and understanding universal laws required for Africa's liberation. Pan-Africanism from Program to Philosophy is a long overdue and much needed source book on the theory of Pan-Africanism. For people new to Pan-Africanist activism, or those who simply want to understand what Pan-Africanism is, this book provides clear theoretical guidance. For seasoned cadres and veterans of the Pan-Africanist movement, it is a checkpoint, a frame of reference for assessing, orientating, or even refocusing the trajectory of their activities. Ideally, it should be studied collectively in groups, particularly those genuinely working towards the liberation of Africa and her people in the context of worldwide liberation. So that gives us a sense of what this book covers, and we will be working with the strategy of Marcus Garvey. I think what we can do now is we can perhaps move on to look at the Libation Corner. Let me just explain that the Libation Corner is a section of the program where we acknowledge our ancestors. So welcome to the Libation Corner. As I've said, this is a section of the program where we acknowledge our ancestors and the historical liberation achievements of our ancestors. Now, you can contribute to the Libation Corner in one of three ways. Firstly, if you have a loved one that has recently passed, you are invited to ring in and have that loved one acknowledged during the Libation Corner. Secondly, if it is the anniversary of the passing of a loved one, then once again you're invited to ring in and have that historical anniversary acknowledged during the Libation Corner. And thirdly, if there's an African historical anniversary that all of us should be remembering at this time, then once again, you're invited, you're welcome to ring in and have that African historical anniversary acknowledged during the libation corner. Let me just say that the number for interaction, studio number, has been restored, I believe, and we may want to test that, is 079 444 313 66. That's 079 444 313 66. Now I'm going to just share some libations, and the way that I do it is very simple. I'll share some libations. If anybody rings in because they want to share a libation, I'll simply stop, allow you to make your contribution to the program or to the libation corner, and then after you've finished, I'll simply resume the libations that I'm sharing. So it'll just be, one or two libations that I share. So today is the 13th of January 2020. And the first libation that I share takes us back more than 100 years, 117 years to be precise, to 1903. Because in 1903, on the 13th of January, one of our ancestors, let me say warmest greetings to you, sister or brother. You are live in the libation corner. How would you like to contribute?
I would like to send...
Okay, I just ask you to bear with me, sister or brother. We're just looking at some of the technicalities here. You appear to be loud and clear, but let me just do another thing very quickly. Just bear with me, sister or brother. I wonder if you'd speak now.
Greetings.
Yes, warmest greetings to you. Warmest greetings to you. Yes, please go ahead and make your contribution.
Okay, well, thank you very much. It's the first time I'm listening to Blessed Radio, and it's great that we have an Afrocentric.
Now, my sister, I want to apologise because the volume seems to be very low. The technicians, I'm sure, are going to look at that, so I'll ask you to just bear with me.
Shall I use a different phone?
Okay, if you carry on, I've turned the music right down. Please, if you would continue now.
Okay, greetings to everybody out there. I just wanted to honour my uncle. His name was Winston Fleury. He came from the island of Carriacou in Grenada.
Ah, yes.
And he passed away. It's my granduncle. He passed away in December. And yeah, I just wanted to honour him this night on the 24th of January. And yeah, he was played a significant part in reviving African spirituality on the island of Carriacou. And the big drum.
Yes, this is a very, very important elder. Clearly, a very important elder who has had a tremendous impact. And the island of Carriacou is a very special island just off the north coast of Grenada. It's a very special island where our traditions have been preserved in a way that is not necessarily the same in all of the islands. So the culture is very strong.
Social media and modernism is kind of creeping in. However, there are people who are keen to hold on to, authenticism of the ancestors, the dance, the drum, and everything. And
Yes.
yeah, members of our family, you know, we mourn at the time, and I just wanted to, just, you know, join with community in honouring my uncle Winston Fleury.
Winston Fleury. Can I ask you one question? Ukapale patwa?
I don't speak Patois, no.
Okay,
Sure he
okay. But I'm certain your uncle spoke it.
He did.
Yeah.
So did my grandfather.
Yeah, absolutely certain. As somebody who actually is a custodian of the culture, there is no doubt in my mind that he would have read it. Can you please say? Go ahead, my sister. Go ahead.
Can I also join with remembering my grandmother Irene Hamlet, who was Winston Fleury's sister. She passed away in April last year, as well. So
thank
we
you,
honour her.
sister. Yes.
And my cousin Lloyd Bideau, he passed away with health complications in June. So yeah, quite a few members of the family.
Well, my sister, I feel it for you. Your family has, you know, been through a lot of transitions this year, and I thank you for just being a part of, or allowing us to be a part of, just acknowledging the contribution that your ancestors have made. Thank you so much, my sister. I really appreciate your call.
Platform in this time, so I really honour it.
Love and respect to you, my sister. Many thanks.
Okay. That's
Okay.
up.
Take care. Bye.
That's up.
So we thank our sister. She has shared 3 libations with us. Thank you so much, sister. And that's the way that it's done here in the Libation Corner. If you want to contribute to the Libation Corner, you just feel free to ring in. It's actually as simple as that. You just feel free to ring in. And as I continue with the libations, and as our sister has just done, she's just rung in and she shared her libations. If you want to do that, I will just stop to allow you to make your contributions. So I'm remembering another of our ancestors, G.T. Woods, who in 1903 on this day, 117 years ago on this day, patented the electric railway system. You know, we had some serious inventors. Some serious inventors. We may have been inventing things for other people now, rather than for ourselves, but we had some very serious inventors. I want to move on to the 15th of January, going back to the year 1901. That's 119 years ago. And one of our ancestors by the name of P.B. Williams patented an electronically controlled and operated railway system. So we had people who were intimately involved in the electrification of the railways, intimately involved, owning patents to certain aspects of the electrification of railways. I'd also like to remember that in 1929, on the 15th of January, one Martin Luther King was born. Well, happy birthday to you. That was the song that Stevie Wonder sang in honor of Martin Luther King. So, you know, had he been alive, he would be 91 years of age today, had he still been alive and with us. We remember Martin Luther King. And moving on to the 17th. The 17th of January, and we remember one of our sporting greats, not one of our sporting greats, the greatest. Because the 17th of January was the birthday of one Muhammad Ali. Muhammad Ali, who refused to go to Vietnam to fight in US Satan's war. I mean, we're talking serious things here. Yeah. He was drafted, and the idea of drafting him was to encourage African people to go to Vietnam to get killed on behalf of US Satan. And he made it clear that he's not going. And he reminded everybody that there's no one in Vietnam that's called him the N-word. So he's got no dispute with the people in Vietnam. He's got a dispute with the people that are calling him to go and get killed in Vietnam. But actually, what they did in his case was, because he was such a superstar, they were going to draft him, but they were going to keep him away from the danger zones. So they were doing all kinds of things to try and encourage him to accept being drawn up to go and fight in the war. But he refused. He went to prison. They took away his world boxing title. And he would come out later to regain the championship, true people's champion. And the final contribution that I'm going to make in this week's Libation Corner is the 19th. That's the 19th of January, going back to the year 1903. One of our ancestors, by the name of A.D. Washington, patents the shoehorn. No, I didn't know that the shoehorn was the creation of an African person. Yes, but it was one of our ancestors, A.D. Washington.
I don't know what to do with myself. All on my hands and knees, wishing for your return. And oh, how I yearn. And I miss you, I miss you, baby. Lord knows I do. I miss you, baby. I really miss you. I said I miss you, baby. Oh, Lord. I said I miss you, 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 baby. I just can't do without you.
So that brings the Libation Corner to a close on this for today, and we're going to move into looking at the strategy of Marcus Garvey. Now, we've been looking at the strategy of Marcus Garvey now for two or 3 weeks actually, and just to give a sense of where we are, because we're a significant way through the strategy now. Just a kind of very shallow and brief overview. Marcus Garvey was essentially, or the UNIA, was essentially about effective organising. And strategy is, of course, about effective organising. So an important milestone in the strategy was developing strong organisation. Now, that strong organisation had to sort out certain issues. Do we move, politically first in order to operate economically more effectively? Or do we move economically first in order to operate politically more effectively? Well, the way that the UNIA dealt with that is they said politics is first. And effective politics allows your economics to flourish. I mean, it's common sense, really. I mean, if you think of a business situation, the politics is the business plan. If you want to operate a business effectively, one of the things that you do is you develop a plan. You may do much more than just a straightforward business plan. You may go through a whole process of visioning, etc. Value, expressing what your values are, etc., etc., and then down to the nuts and bolts of cash flows, etc., etc. These are the kinds of things that go into the business plan. This is the politics. Politics is the thinking. Economics is the doing. The UNIA understood this, and so it dealt with, it dealt with the political side in order to be more effective economically. The organisation, in its strategy, also made education an important priority. So the idea was not just to have lots of people joining, which it did successfully, 6 million at one point, 11 million at a later point. But it was to transform those people, to make those people more effective than they were before. So when we join an organization, we join it not just to improve the organization, but we expect the organization to improve us. And so that was an important part of the strategy of the UNIA. So it was to encourage people to join, which it did with great success. To transform those people, that was a more difficult task. And it had some successes there, but you can always improve. And then it was to make that organization not just an organization, but a government for African people. So if you look carefully at what Garvey was doing, or what the UNIA was doing, it was building an African government. Now let's understand that there's a difference between a crowd and an organization. You see people come together for a football match, and that's a crowd. But organization has a much more clearly defined purpose. And there are different types of organization. So there's a movement, a general movement of people that come together for a one-off cause, but an organization has a much more sophisticated reason for coming together. And governing the African continent has to be the most sophisticated of reasons for us as a people to come together. And that was the task that the UNIA took on in its strategy. So attracting people was one milestone. Building the organization was another milestone. Making those people more effective was another milestone. Deciding on the ideas and crystallizing the ideas that will propel the organization forward, politics, economics. Is it an organization for everybody, or is it an organization for African people? The UNIA was an organization for African people. Anybody couldn't just come and join. It was for African people. Is it about self-determination? Or is it about, trying to create senators in US Satan, or congressmen in US Satan? Well, the UNIA was very clear on this. It was about building a government for African people that would govern Africa. So these kinds of ideas had to be, had to be teased out, discussed, debated, and sorted in order that the organisation would move forward. Now, as an organisation of African people, the next question that had to be dealt with strategically was, right, what are our relations with others? Non-Africans, when I say others. What are our relations with non-African people? I mean, do we say we don't want anything to do with you lot because, we're so impacted by your racism? Or do we say we will build some kind of relationship with the more positive elements of you despite your racism? Well, the UNIA answered in the second of those scenarios. It built relations with the more progressive elements or the more positive elements of non-African groupings in order to meet its objectives, not their objectives, its objectives. So it built anti-imperialist alliances, for instance. Anti-imperialist alliances were built. And those anti-imperialist alliances were built with the likes of, so for instance, when I say alliances, there were relationships beginning to develop. Sometimes they hadn't developed as far as an alliance, but relations were clearly developed with the people of India. And there were messages sent to Mahatma Gandhi, for instance, supporting the struggles of the people of India against imperialism, against the colonizers who were in India. Messages were sent to China. So the UNIA supported the Chinese people's right to be liberated from the yoke of colonialism. Messages were sent to Egypt, Arab-dominated Egypt, supporting their struggle to release themselves from the colonialism of Britain, as it was in that case. Messages of support were even sent to Ireland. So the IRA had a link with the UNIA. Technically it would have been Sinn Féin rather than the IRA. The IRA is the military wing of Sinn Féin. So the political relationship was with Sinn Féin. But the leader of Sinn Féin and Marcus Garvey were in correspondence. They used to write to each other. And there were actual initiatives in operation jointly. And this, remember, is despite the anti-African racism of Irish people. There's no pretense that there was no racism. On another front, on the repatriation front, Garvey built an alliance even with far-right racist Europeans. The Ku Klux Klan, and Anglo-Saxon clubs of US Satan. And they've got all kinds of strange names for these organizations. These were the people who were lynching us. And Garvey and the UNIA built a secret alliance with at least one of those organizations. Wouldn't go public and say there's an alliance, but built secret alliance with at least one of those organizations. And the demands from the UNIA were twofold. The first was, it was threefold. It was, one, stop killing our people. Put a stop to the lynching. So he was in negotiation with, or he entered into at least some negotiation with the deputy imperial wizard of the Ku Klux Klan, with a view to, putting an end to the lynching. That was one. The second thing that demand that he was making was that you must stop raping our women. African women were unprotected from European men. There was this fiction that African men, wanted to have intimate relations with European women. And so what they would do is they would lynch African men, saying that they looked at a European woman in a way that suggested they desired her. And so they would actually kill African men, lynch African men, on this nonsense, on this this pretense that that we had a desire for them. At the same time, the European men would rape African women who were unprotected, even by us as African men. So the second demand was Garvey was making was to put an end to that kind of madness. And the third demand that Garvey was making was to enter into some level of agreement for them to support the repatriation process of African people back to Africa. You see, the racists wanted us out of US Satan. The UNIA was working on a repatriation program. If they want us out and we want to go, there's common ground. And so they operated on the basis of of that common ground. These were just in their infancy. They didn't develop into major alliances. But it answers the question, because Garvey and the UNIA built relations with the devil almost, if they felt it was in the interest of African people to do so. And then the next part of the strategy, I'm just kind of giving a very brief overview. The next part of the strategy was having formed a government, having decided how you're going to deal with relations with non-Africans, was let's get back to Africa. Let's take our governmental structures back to Africa. And remember, the governmental structures were in existence. The UNIA conferences, conventions, which had up to 25,000 people in attendance, were our parliament. So our parliament, everybody could go to the parliament, or anybody that lived locally could go to the parliament. It's not like here where they just got a few MPs and stuff. Everybody could go. So 25,000 of us would go, and that would be our parliament where we'd make decisions. In that parliament, for instance, there was a proposal put forward for a UNIA passport to be developed. This is serious stuff, and that passport was necessary because of the intentions that we had to repatriate back to Africa. So the UNIA was going to issue passports to African people. If all the plans had gone in the way that that was intended, there would have been UNIA passports. The plan didn't get that far enough for that to actually happen. But the Parliament discussed it and agreed that we should have our passports, and we can issue passports because we got our ships. Remember, that's what the Black Star Liner was about. Yeah, we've got our ships. We can take people there. So the passports are our business, nobody else's business. So we can issue passports. So they were operating like a government. Now, the weakness of the UNIA operating as a government, and I say as a government, they had paid officials. So all of the senior officers of the UNIA were paid. They were paid government officials, African government officials. Yeah. so one of the weaknesses was we had government structures, but the government didn't have a land base. So we had a government that was sitting on somebody else's land in US Satan, not any old somebody else's land. The worst enemy we could think of was sitting on their land. Well, maybe apart from Britain. Yeah, and we didn't have any land of our own. So the repatriation effort was in part to take that government back to Africa and to build, a state, an African state. So I think that's really where we have got up to in terms of the strategy. And the part that we're going to deal with today is, okay, when you get there, what are you going to do? When you actually get onto the land, what are you going to do? How are you going to go about building this government? In a nutshell, Garvey talked about driving the Europeans out, getting a foothold and driving the Europeans out of Africa as a stage to reuniting the motherland. And so, if you're talking about driving the people out, or driving Europeans out of our motherland, then you're actually talking about armed struggle. So the return to Africa was going to be a bloody return. And so let's look at what Garvey, or some of the things that Garvey had to say in that respect. So when we return, we're returning with the intention of reclaiming African land. And I'm now going to just start reading. No, in fact, before I start reading, let me make a few points. I'm going to make a few more points. We need to remember that the UNIA was a paramilitary organization. It came into existence effectively during World War I. So there was a world war going on. The world was a violent world. People were dying in massive numbers. And the UNIA was no play organization. The UNIA was peopled by war veterans. People who had come back from the war. We're talking about 1918 onwards. People who had come back from the war and were not ready to take nonsense from anybody, whether they're European or whatever they are. Our people had come back and they had seen how Europeans die in war, and they probably killed a few as well during the war, because they call it friendly fire. Don't like somebody, that's the racist I don't like. Probably, some of them turned their gun in another direction and killed people who were in the war terms on their side. But they understood that the European was not invincible, and so they were prepared to fight. They were hardened war veterans. And so the UNIA had, seriously tough people in it. Seriously tough people. People who not only knew how to kill, but had practiced killing officially during the war. And so I want you to have an understanding of the militancy that existed at the time, which is, we play it down, but there was real militancy at that point. And the UNIA was organized as basically a military outfit. The divisions in it were basically military outfits. The Black Star Line was actually a navy. It wasn't just a transport ships. It was the beginnings of the African Navy. There was an air force, and we had hardened war veterans, and so just put it plainly, people were killed. When people messed with the UNIA, they were killed. There's no proof necessarily that it was UNIA people that killed them, but the suspicion has got to, it's strong. The suspicion is strong that they were killed by members in the membership of the UNIA. So, for instance, there's an African woman from Ghana by the name of Laura Kofi. She was a very senior African woman, a very senior person in the organization. And she fell out with the organization and took, many thousands of people with her as she walked away from the organization. She was found dead. Now, we can't say that it was UNIA members that killed her because there's no proof. But we can't dismiss the possibility either. I've forgotten his name now. There was another very senior person in the organization. Very, very senior person. At one point, he was the leader of the African people in US Satan within the context of the UNIA. And he fell out with the organization. He too was killed. Again, we don't know. There's no proof that he was killed by members of the UNIA, but we can't rule out that possibility. To get a sense of how militant the UNIA actually was, Garvey went to speak had a speaking engagement in the South. Off the top of my head, I think the city was St. Louis, somewhere in the south of US Satan. My geography is not good enough for me to be able to tell you precisely where St. Louis is. Maybe somebody can ring in and help us there. But anyway, Garvey went for a meeting there. And the Ku Klux Klan decided that Garvey would not be allowed to speak. And so the Ku Klux Klan, wearing their police uniforms, turned up armed and dangerous at the UNIA meeting to prevent Garvey from speaking in their city. And they came in, with their guns, held in their hands, ready for a fight. And then the African people in the hall, they pulled out their guns and they said, "Let Garvey speak." So the Africans all of them just pulled out their guns. And then when the Ku Klux Klan saw that they were not going to leave that place alive, that the Africans were prepared to die, Garvey was going to speak because they would, the Africans had outnumbered them and had more guns than them, would have killed them off in there, even if some of the Africans had been killed. Then they relented and they lowered their arms. This is the kind of militancy that you're talking about now. We're talking about, yeah. So they put down their arms, and then Garvey stood on the stage and he said to them, "Welcome. I've reserved these front row seats for you." So it was an ambush. These were military people. They knew what was going to happen. These Africans who were military people, they knew what was going to happen. So when the Ku Klux Klan came in, they ambushed them in there, and they even had seats for them in the front row. And told them, "Go and sit down and listen." And Garvey spoke with such a passion Garvey was so powerful in his presentation that even the Ku Klux Klan was impressed. And they ran back to tell their leadership about what they heard Garvey say. And then the leadership of the Ku Klux Klan asked for a meeting with Garvey. Based on the report that they received, they couldn't believe that there's this African, who can put them under manners. And then when they listened to what he said about repatriation and other things, they were sufficiently impressed for them to ask for a meeting with the UNIA. But the point that I'm making is these are indications of the militancy. Marcus Garvey himself, there was an attempt to assassinate Marcus Garvey. A man came in to his office under the guise of wanting to have a meeting with him, and he was allowed to come in. And when he got in there, he pulled out a gun and started shoot at Garvey. And it was the gunman plus Marcus Garvey plus Amy Ashwood. She was not yet Garvey. They were not yet married at that point. And Amy Ashwood saved Marcus Garvey's life because she just put herself in between the gun and Marcus Garvey. In other words, she was saying to the gunman, if you want to kill him, you got to kill me first. And it looked like the gunman had a little bit of heart in him. So he didn't end up killing Garvey. He managed to shoot Garvey, but he couldn't get a clear shot to kill Garvey. And so Garvey survived. So I'm just giving a sense of the militancy that existed at that point in time. So now let's move forward. Let's move forward. I'm going to go back to section 2.6 so we can get a sense of there's this militancy in the UNIA and there's this movement now to go to the movement now to go to Africa. That's the intention, to go to Africa. Now what are we going to do when we get there? That's the point that we've reached. Paragraph 2.6 is what I'm reading from, and it's called Reclaim All African Lands. A nation without land is a contradiction in terms. The fact that every inch of African land was under the political control of Africa's imperialist enemy was an obvious blockage to the building of an African nation at home. Garvey was under no illusions. He knew that the recovery of African land by its legitimate owners would not be achieved by diplomatic efforts alone. Now let me just say this, that not every inch of African land was under the enemy's control. Ethiopia at that point was independent, and Ethiopia had successfully repelled the attack of the Italians. The great Melinek defeated the Italians in 1896, and as a result, we're talking about the 1920s now. Some 25 years or so after that, Ethiopia is independent and is an independent nation. It didn't really have full independence in the sense that it was in an Africa which was where it was surrounded by the colonizing enemy, but at least they were able to hold on to that part of Africa for us. 2.61, bloodshed for the birth of the African nation. I'll continue. European imperialists were not prepared to give up even an inch of Africa to each other without a fight, as evidenced by World War I. It followed that there was no prospect whatsoever of them returning the land which they had stolen to its rightful owners, that is, of course, African people. Garvey was fully aware that the reclaiming of African land would involve nothing less than a fight to the death with Africa's imperialist enemies. So, for instance, and let's go here with a quote from Garvey. Garvey's words. He says, "Of course we'll have to kick the Europeans out of Africa. You would like to know by what means we are going to carry out this task. Allow me not to speak, for I would let out a secret of this organization." So he's making it clear. Garvey's making it clear that we are going to have to use military force to remove the colonizing Europeans from Africa in order that we can build up our own government in our homeland. Another quote from Garvey. He says, "You will realize that liberty and democracy are very expensive things, and you have to give life for it. And if we, that's Africans, think we can get all these things without shedding blood for them, we are making a dreadful mistake. You are not going to get anything unless you organize and fight for it. There are some things you can get, there are some things you can fight for constitutionally. But as your political rights, such as your political rights, your civil rights, but to get liberty, you have to shed blood for it. And that is what the UNIA is preparing your minds for, to shed some blood so as to make your race a free and independent race. The blood we are not going to shed in Newport News. The blood we are not going to shed in US Satan, because US Satan will not be big enough to hold the African when the African gets ready. But the blood we are preparing to shed one day on the African battlefield, because it is the determination of the new African to repossess himself of that country, that God gave his forefathers. Africa is the richest continent in the world. It is the country that has given civilization to mankind and has made the white man what he is. So Garvey is making it very clear. He's talking bloodshed. We're going to have to shed blood in order to bring justice into this world. Some of our blood will have to spill also in order to bring justice into this world. But our enemy's blood definitely has to spill. And he's clarifying that that blood is not going to be spilt in US Satan or anywhere else. That blood's going to be spilt in Africa to get them out. Now, let's be very clear that when we look at the figures now, the demographic figures, in Africa right now, the population is 1.3 billion people. That's the population of Africa right now. 1.3 billion. That's not including the diaspora. That's another 400 million on top. But 1.3 billion in Africa. And the population, let me do it this way. A billion has 9 zeros after it. Yeah? So there are 9 zeros after a billion. There are only 6 zeros after a million. The population of Europeans in Africa is 6 million. They don't even make up a half of 1%. In fact, they don't even make up a half of 1/10%. They make up something like a half of 100th of 1%. That's how small their numbers are in Africa. If we organize and rise up, we crush them. It's as simple as it's as simple as that. The numbers are stacked so fully in our favor. And Garvey understood it. I mean, numbers were not as dramatically in our favor at that time. It's more dramatically in our favor now. But the point is that we outnumber all other people in our land, as is to be expected. and Garvey is saying that the war will happen in our land. That's if they want to fight, if they're stupid enough to fight. And they will be brave enough to fight as long as we're not organised. As soon as we become organised, that's the end of the matter. We can sort out anybody on our homeland. So here's an example, supplying under the heading, supplying weapons to the needy. Garvey was not advocating that the UNA should return to Africa in an attempt to liberate it over and above the heads of its sisters and brothers on the motherland. It was his position that the UNIA should arm its sisters and brothers as part of a program of driving the colonialist enemy out of Africa. And as he put it, here are the words of Garvey. Yeah, he says, African people in Kenya stopped all public vehicles and told those white robbers riding in them to get out and walk. Now, that shows some spirit. Anyhow, stopped every buggy, stopped every carriage that went by and told the occupants to get out and walk. That shows they're coming, doesn't it? The only handicap they had was that they had sticks and stones. Now it is for you men and women who are mixed up with modern civilization for 300 years to give them something else besides sticks and stones. You have to give them the latest output of science. I won't tell you what it is. It means that you and I must get busy, because all the Africans now have are sticks and stones, and you cannot do anything with weapons, with such weapons and means of defence. So what Garvey is showing us here is that part of the duty of African people in the diaspora is to bring the new technology, bring the weapons to our sisters and brothers back home, in order that they can do what's necessary on the ground to sort out matters and to regain sovereignty on our motherland. Now that situation has changed now. Africa now is just full of weapons. The imperialists have just put so many weapons in there, taught us how to shoot guns at each other. We have got a whole heap of weapons there. Our task now is actually to point those weapons in the right direction. So that's a serious task that we have ahead of us. But continuing, there is little doubt that the US Satan authorities treated Garvey's words seriously. It invested considerable resources into spying on the UNIA, with the aim of unearthing more. So, for instance, and I'm reading from a report. I think last week I explained there's a history to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The CIA is like the modern day intelligence wing of US Satan for external spying. So the CIA does the external spying. Here in Britain, the external spies are called MI6. So MI6 does for Britain what the CIA does for US Satan. They spy on people in other countries. Now, before there was a CIA, there was a Federal Bureau of Investigation. So the Federal Bureau of Investigation, which was in charge of spying inside US Satan, the equivalent of MI5 here in Britain, that spies inside Britain. The FBI or the CIA came out of the FBI. But the FBI itself was not the original. The original, back in the 1920s, was called the BI, the Bureau of Investigation. It was not yet the Federal Bureau of Investigation. It was the Bureau of Investigation. J. Edgar Hoover was an operative there, and he was actually assigned to Garvey. he's been making a nuisance of himself, or he's making a nuisance of himself, from then right up till the Black Panthers and beyond. Yeah, so J. Edgar Hoover was involved in the spying on Marcus Garvey. But anyway, this comment here, or this quote here, comes from a military intelligence report. And it reads as follows. It says, one of the principal informers on Negro subversion for the Military Intelligence Division alleged that Garvey and his friends of Irish freedom were linked. You see, they didn't necessarily call themselves the IRA. They had other names too, Friends of Irish Freedom. Yeah. Military Intelligence Division disclosed in its confidential weekly situation survey of the 23rd of June 1920 that its informer, R.D. Jonas, had publicly declared that the Friends of Irish Freedom had aided in establishing the Black Star shipping line, which would ultimately carry arms to Africa. So I understand that the Irish, or the IRA or Sinn Féin, etc., their supporters in US Satan, they were actually assisting the process of getting the Black Star shipping line for the UNIA. So it was our ship, and we were doing our thing. We were raising our shares, etc. But they were supportive of that process. I don't know whether they actually put any money into it, and they may well have even put some money into it. But I cannot confirm that as a fact. I don't know that level of detail. But there's no doubt that they were supportive of it. There were also plans for them to load weapons onto the Black Star shipping line, our Navy, remember, and those weapons to be taken back to Africa. So you can see how the whole thing is coming together. And so what you had was Europeans helping to arm Africans to go and drive Europeans out of Africa. So this is the way that alliances, work in a nutshell. But continuing on, the paramilitary character of the UNIA is the next section. Garvey and the UNIA were preparing for the armed struggle stage of the African Revolution, with the aim of cooperating with home-based African people to drive the colonialists out of Africa. This would be a prelude to setting up of a continental-wide African national government. He, of course, recognized that it would be tactically inept to openly declare that fact, and therefore merely alluded to the necessity of armed struggle. Whilst the message of armed struggle was definitely present in his words, he would stop short of publicly calling for it or declaring it. So understand that Garvey, when he speaks in militant terms, is still being tactical. Yeah, he's not just shouting, "We're going to shoot you down, we're going to kill you off," etc., etc. There's a certain subtlety in the way that he speaks militarily. And of course that makes complete sense, given that he's in the mad country US Satan. It makes complete sense. Here's a quote from Garvey, because he nonetheless insisted. Let me give this quote. This quote, it says, "We of the UNIA are advocating the right for Africa to develop herself as a mighty nation and give to herself the same kind of naval and military protection, military protecting us as other races." So, basically what he's saying, I mean, it sounds kind of ordinary, but it's revolutionary at that time. The notion of an African army defending African interests had been beaten down. Our soldiers were all busy protecting other people. had no defence for ourselves. And Garvey's saying, look, we need a military for ourselves. We need to be able to defend ourselves militarily. You know, this is not a play situation. We need to have our army, and we need to fight all comers who come into teeth our land. This was Garvey's position. Reading on. This was no idle statement. The existence of the Black Cross Nurses, the African Legion, the Universal African Motor Corps, the Black Eagle Flying Corps, made the paramilitary nature of the UNIA obvious. Many of its members were military veterans, hardened in World War I. Not only were they proven capable of fighting to the death, but they were part of an African military structure semi-openly preparing to do so. Furthermore, these trained soldiers were part of the 1 million skilled African people who were to be repatriated back to Africa. They would be tasked with spearheading and coordinating the process of driving the European colonialist enemy out of Africa. Remember when we looked at repatriation, Garvey had a plan to ship 1 million Africans from USA or from the Americas over to Africa, to Liberia in particular, where the deal had been made. So he had a plan to ship 1 million people over. I mean, and we're talking about a force now. When you've got 1 million people over there, plus our own people who are already there. And remember, many of those are soldiers who are already training the others who are not military trained, so that what we have is a military force of 1 million who are going over. We meant business. We meant business. We were going over to run things. Continuing. The prospect of African people taking back their homeland under the leadership of the UNIA struck fear into the hearts of imperialists everywhere. Oppressive measures were unleashed across the imperialist world with the objective of stopping African people from exposure to UNIA's official organ, the Negro World. Now, the Negro World, as we've discussed, was the newspaper of the UNIA. It was the most popular African newspaper in the world. It was the most widely read African newspaper in the world. And it spoke, it documented the ideas that we're discussing here. The liberation of African people. So, in particular, French colonialism in Dahomey went berserk and declared a sentence of death against any African in the colony found to have a copy of the UNIA's newspaper in their possession. Here it is. So, if I've been to Dahomey, if you were in Dahomey, and if you had a copy of the Negro World, the UNIA's newspaper, in your possession, the sentence was death. The people are mad. Well, maybe not so mad, because they know what it represents. Now, there was a whole infrastructure in which the Black Star shipping line played an important role. But there were a whole heap of sailors, Africans who were sailors, and those sailors, many of them, were actually members of the UNIA. And so when they used to sail, whether it was on the Black Star shipping line or whatever ships they worked on, when they used to sail, they would take, bundles of copies of the Black Star shipping line with them, and they would take those and they would distribute them all around the world. They would get as far as Australia with the Negro World, but certainly they got to Africa. And then, what would happen is, especially in Africa, what would happen is there would be somebody who would read the newspaper to different people, to a crowd of people. And the crowd of people would be runners. And they would run back to their villages. And then they would recite the newspaper to the people in the villages. That was their job. The oral tradition in Africa is a strong tradition. Yeah, and so that was the way that many people in Africa got the messages that were in the Negro world. Yeah, those who could read would read, but they didn't just read for themselves; they read for everybody. So it was to share. It was to share that information. So the Negro world was a powerful organ. It was so powerful. There were some people in Africa who actually thought that Garvey was coming to release them from colonialism. Well, he was, but they were. People. I spoke to one elder. And he was in his 80s. In the 1990s. And he's from Azania, what today is called, what some people call South Africa. He's from Azania, this elder. A member of the Pan-Afrikan Congress of Azania, actually. His name, Elder Bojana Jordan. If he's alive now, I'm not in touch with him. If he's alive now, he'll be over 100. Yeah. But he was based in US Satan. He was based in New York, having been exiled from South Africa during the 1960s when the Pan-African Congress was banned. But anyway, this elder was telling me that when he was a boy, there was a picture of Marcus Garvey in the main room in his house. And that his dad used to say to him, "You see that man there? Marcus Garvey, that's your uncle." And so he was brought up, told that Marcus Garvey is your uncle. That was how much Garvey was taken to the hearts of our people in Africa. Our people in Africa were waiting for Garvey to come and release them from colonialism. He was a loved man in Africa. Even though he never set foot there himself, he never got the chance to actually set foot there himself, he was a loved man in Africa. But let me read on. In this same climate of fear, US Satan, aware that the UNIA posed a significant internal military threat, acted secretly against Garvey. It is well known that the UNIA was heavily infiltrated with US Satan government spies. They systematically reported back as many details of the inner workings of the UNIA to their paymasters as they could. As a result of their activities, the Bureau of Investigation wrote a number of secret reports into the activities of the UNIA. Aware that he was under surveillance in a nation controlled by genocidal murdering maniacs who would not hesitate to slaughter the African population in their country, Garvey made it clear that the UNIA's military activities did not relate to a military struggle on US Satan soil. Let me quote from Garvey here. These are Garvey's words where he's clarifying what he means by armed struggle. He says, "We're tired of being kicked around. We're tired of being tossed around. The hour has come for a definite decision, and we're about to take the step of decision. In this convention assembled, we would like the world to understand that the African is prepared to be as peaceful now as he has always been, but nobody knows that the African is preparing to demand the things that are his. Yield up the things belonging to the African, and we will have everlasting and abiding peace. It may seem strange to hear the African talk in these terms, but that is the only medium through which men get salvation. War, to me, is the only medium through which man can seek redemption." I'll read that bit again. This is what Garvey said. He said, "War, to me, is the only medium through which man can seek redemption." Now understand me well. We are gathered as an international body not to start war in any country where a government is already constituted, but we are organized the world over, first of all, to demand the things that belong to Africans in Africa. And if you refuse them, what you get, please take. A compromising coward has never won anything yet since the dawn of creation. So, Garvey, again, very subtly in the way that he uses language, he's making it clear that, licks are coming, war is coming, but he's also clarifying that the war for African liberation is not going to be fought in US Satan, in Britain, or in Europe, or in the America. That's not the mainstay of the war. The war for liberation will be fought in Africa, because the objective is for us to reclaim our land. Garvey was preparing for more than a mere return to the motherland. He was preparing for war on African soil. It would be aimed at physically driving the colonizers out of our homeland to clear the path for Africa's united continental-wide superstate. Some of the French colonizers saw clearly what was coming and realized that Garvey's desired outcome would mean death to them. This explains why they went berserk and declared the death sentence on any African person found carrying the UNI's newspaper in their possession. Now, just to close this section, 2.64 is armed struggle, a hidden aspect of Garvey, and it's just a summary really, and it reads as follows. Garvey made many statements hinting at armed struggle, or more precisely fighting to the death for African people's freedom, which are not generally well known. This is in part because of their exclusion from philosophies and opinions. When Amy Jacques Garvey published The Philosophy and Opinions of Marcus Garvey, or Africa for the Africans, in 1925, Garvey was an unjustly incarcerated political prisoner, having been the victim of a US Satan kangaroo court. The primary objective at that point was to get him out. It is therefore understandable that his words on subjects such as brute force, bloodshed, liberty or death, the necessity of war for redemption were tactically excluded from that compilation. In historical terms, this is nothing more than a hiccup. Thanks to the organizing efficiency of our ancestors, his words on the necessity of armed struggle for an independent African nation remain available to us to learn from to this very day. So, that, if you like, is a kind of summary on the armed struggle section. Let's do a little kind of musical interlude. Let's see how that works for us. The revolution will not be televised.
You will not be able to stay home, brother. You will not be able to plug in, turn on, and cop out. You will not be able to lose yourself on Skag and skip out for beer during commercials because the revolution will not be televised. The revolution will not be televised. The revolution will not be brought to you by Xerox in 4 parts without commercial interruptions. The revolution will not show you pictures of Nixon blowing a bugle and leading a charge by John Mitchell, General Abrams, and Spyro Agnew to eat hog maws confiscated from a Harlem sanctuary. The revolution will not be televised. The revolution will not be brought to you by the Schaefer Award Theater and will not star Natalie Woods and Steve McQueen or Bullwinkle and Julia. The revolution will not give your mouth sex appeal. The revolution will not get rid of the nubs. The revolution will not make you look 5 pounds thinner, because the revolution will not be televised, brother. There will be no pictures of you and Willie Mae pushing that shopping cart down the block on the dead run, or trying to slide that color TV into a stolen ambulance. NBC will not be able to predict the winner at 8:32 on report from 29 districts. The revolution will not be televised. There will be no pictures of pigs shooting down brothers on the instant replay. There will be no pictures of pigs shooting down brothers on the instant replay. There will be no pictures of Whitney Young being run out of Harlem on a rail with a brand new process. There will be no slow motion or still life of Roy Wilkins strolling through Watts in a red, black, and green liberation jumpsuit that he has been saving for just the proper occasion. Green Acres, Beverly Hillbillies, and Hooterville Junction will no longer be so damn relevant, and women will not care if Dick finally got down with Jane on Search for Tomorrow, because black people will be in the street looking for a brighter day. The revolution will not be televised. There will be no highlights on the 11 o'clock news and no pictures of Harry R. women liberationists and Jackie Onassis blowing her nose. The theme song will not be written by Jim Webb or Francis Scott Key, nor sung by Glenn Campbell, Tom Jones, Johnny Cash, Engelbert Humperdinck, or The Rare Earth. The revolution will not be televised. The revolution will not be right back after a message about a white tornado, white lightning, or white people. You will not have to worry about a dove in your bedroom, the tiger in your tank, or the giant in your toilet bowl. The revolution will not go better with coke. The revolution will not fight germs that may cause bad breath. The revolution will put you in the driver's seat. The revolution will not be televised, will not be televised, will not be televised, will not be televised. The revolution will be no rerun, brothers. The revolution will be live.
Yes, the revolution will not be televised. And it's interesting. I don't think, did they have TVs then? I don't think they had televisions then. There was cinema in existence at the time. There were silent movies, I think, around those times, but the television did not exist then. And as we were informed later, the revolution will not be televised. So let's move on a little bit. We're going to move on to the next section in a few minutes that we have left. And the next section is the building of a powerful, just, and united African continent. You see, Garvey and the UNIA were returning to Africa not just for some kind of bloodbath. No. The military aspect was necessary in order to move to building a united Africa. So he knew, he was clear that that European imperialism, the colonizers, would not go willingly, would not give up Africa willingly. That's quite obvious. I mean, they're arguing amongst themselves about Africa, and the last people that they want to have a stake in Africa would be the African people themselves, us, who have a legitimate claim to it. So the objective was to unite Africa, to have Africa under one government, of the people, by the people, and for the people, to use a famous, almost cliche. Yeah. So, Garvey's Pan-African nation-building agenda. Marcus Garvey is arguably the greatest grassroots African organizer of the 20th century. But he and his contemporaries were not building organization for organization's sake. They were building it as a means to confronting the greatest problem facing African people in the world, in a world controlled by European imperialism. Everyone, apart from African people, seemed to control a stake in Africa. In broad daylight, the continent was stolen from under the feet of its people. The disorganization of African people had allowed this to happen, and fueling imperialism's greed eventually led to World War. The task, therefore, was the reclaiming of Africa by the only people with a just claim, that is us, African people. On the 30th of October 1919, Garvey expressed the problem in these following words. So here's what Garvey had to say about this problem. He says, "We were misinformed about Africa for 300 years. But in 1919, the new African is not misinformed about Africa. He is well informed about Africa, and he knows that Africa is the richest continent in the world. He knows that Africa is the bone of contention between the white men and yellow men. He knows that the fight between Britain and Germany was a fight for African aggrandizement. Up to now, the Kaiser would have been giving them trouble if it were not for the African. We have defeated the Kaiser and have given victory to the Allies, England, France, and Italy. But we are not through with the war because we intend to take Africa for 400 million black folks in the world. England has been living as a parasite on the great continent of Africa. But today, every black man intends to pick on the parasite and throw that parasite away. We say, if Africa is good enough to build up England, if Africa is good enough to build up France, if Africa is good enough to build up Italy and build up Belgium, the Belgium of Leopold of the Congo, then Africa ought to be good enough to find a home and a place in the sun for black Ethiopians scattered all over the world. So, Garvey is showing us in a nutshell what it's all about. So, in 1919, over 100 years ago, Garvey was telling us, look, Africa's the richest land in the world. They're all after it. And he, you notice he talked about the yellow men. He was talking about the Chinese even then. There's a lot of excitement about Chinese activity in Africa now. Garvey was mentioning that over 100 years ago. Yeah? But the point is, it's the Europeans that have had hegemony over Africans. It's European imperialism that has had hegemony over Africa. And the reason for that is Africa is the richest land in the world. Not just marginally rich. Maybe I should just take a little bit of time now to talk about the riches of Africa, Well, let me read on here, and if there's time, I'll say a little something about how rich Africa is, because it's an important subject. Yeah. Now, Garvey and the UNIA's Africa for Africa objective was to build a thriving continental-wide sovereign African nation-state with a civilization of its own for the defense of African people everywhere. Now, this was his rationale. Again, these are the words of Garvey. Yeah? Every careful student of political science can foresee a future of tears for those who are not prepared to defend themselves by strong organization. When we say political organization, we do mean as confined to one's domestic district. Sorry, we do not mean as confined to one's domestic district, where you live, as the subject or citizen of a government that is controlled by an alien race. We mean political organization that is indeed independent to race. That political organization will make you an independent political unit among the nations and races of the world. We mean the political organization called independent government. So, Garvey is talking about us having self-determination, not building up other people's countries for them, which is the trap that we've fallen into. Having independent nations, an independent nation where we can build ourselves up, where we can have self-determination. And you see, we have the wealthiest land in the world under our feet. So when we take control of our land, when we take that political control, we have all the economics under our feet. Everybody else will be coming to us basically begging. But let me continue. With that purpose in mind, Garvey was helping to build national structures through the various projects being developed via the UNIA. He was helping to lay the foundations for a united Pan-Africanist national government together with the essential ingredients of its defence force and economy. These Pan-Africanist structures would be transplanted back into Africa as part of a centrally coordinated mass repatriation program for those diasporan Africans who decided that they could best serve their people by returning to Africa. Garvey had already made clear, and he had made this clear in a speech on the 28th of February 1990, Garvey had already made clear that none of this could be achieved in the absence of effective organisation. Now I'm going to read a quote here from Garvey. It's quite a long quote, so just bear with me. It's quite a long quote, and it speaks to effective organisation. So, Garvey says, and these are his words, organisation is the force that rules the world. All people have gained their freedom through organised force. All nations, empires have grown into greatness through organised methods. These are the means by which we, as a race, will climb to greatness. The world around us is organising itself today. The white world of Europe is so organised as to be able to protect itself from foreign invasion. Asia is organising to repel the aggressor. Africa at home and abroad are the only open doors that suggest exploitation and robbery of other peoples. When I say Africa at home, I mean the 280 million of blacks who live on the continent that God gave us as our heritage. There we have no well-organised government for protection. Because of that, all alien races of Europe have invaded that territory, and they have subjugated the teeming millions to serfdom and slavery. Africa abroad is suffering from many abuses. In US Satan, we have the lynch rope around our necks. In the West Indian Islands, we are relegated to the ditch of industrial stagnation. Nowhere in this broad universe are we recognized as a competent race simply because we have failed in the most essential weapon, that is organization. Let us be organized in Brooklyn tonight as we are organized in other parts of the country and in the West Indies. This war that has been won by the Allied nations was fought for a great principle. It was that of giving all peoples the right to govern themselves. Now that there is peace in the affairs of the world are to be settled, we find that every race except the African will have a voice in the principle of self-determination. And why is it so? Because all of them are organised. In the matter of comparison, you can hardly find any race of people standing on the same political platform as an African. They might suffer disadvantages such as the Poles, but none of these countries suffer in the way that Africa suffers. Africa of 12 million square miles is the most congenial country in the world for African people. Every spot that is habitable has become the domain of the white man, and he has possessed himself of it, not by matter of conquest alone, but through the easiest methods possible, simply because there has been no organized resistance. The time for peaceful penetration of the black man by the white man is past, and the time for determined resistance has come. And it is on that platform that we of the UNIA stand. We are determined to live and die free men. We who are free never admit of inroads into our rights. When such inroads are attempted, the result has always been a fight to the finish. When Germany made her inroad into the political boundaries of Northern Europe, there was an organized resistance to repel her. She has been whipped, and I am now saying to you, people in Brooklyn tonight, that the same methods that were used by the Allied governments in whipping Germany to her knees for the intrusion that she made into the rights of other peoples is the same course that we must take as a universal people to repel the aggressor on the African continent. Africa will be a bloody battlefield in the years to come. We cannot tell who the foeman will be, whether he be English, French, German, Belgian, or Dutch. But there is one thing we are determined on, that we are going to fight it out and with him to the finish. That finish must mean victory for the African standard. Freedom has become a sacred possession for men. No race can be completely free, living as subjects of an alien race. The African is tired of being a subject. He is tired of being a citizen without rights. And the time now is ripe when we should guarantee freedom, even at the cost of our lives. One generation must die in half, even to save the other generation in whole. As for me, the spirit of Patrick Henry still moves. It is the spirit of liberty or death. There has always been one consolation for me, which I gained out of this war. I, as a young man, could have died in France, in Flanders or Mesopotamia, fighting for the brutal Belgian. Since I could have died without achieving anything for myself after the victory, I am now resolved to try the game of dying for myself. But before I die, I feel sure my blood will have paid that remission for which generations of the African race shall be declared free. Freedom of action, freedom of opportunity are the things we need, which I believe can only be gained after we shall establish an imperial power to command respect of other nations and races. That's some heavy-duty stuff coming from Marcus Garvey. Those were his words on that subject. Those of you that have recorded the program, you can go over these words later. We're coming up to the 10 o'clock hour, so I won't go into it too much here. But reading on, Marcus Garvey and the UNIA stood for the unification and liberation of Africa and her people under a just social system. It understood that African people were one people regardless of whether they were born at home in Africa or overseas in the diaspora. The UNIA uncompromisingly advocated Africa for the Africans and for them exclusively. And Garvey advised fellow African people that, and I'm going to quote Garvey again. Garvey says, "The best thing for everyone to do is to unite, and so fortify ourselves by building up a strong government in Africa that as citizens of that government we can claim protection in any part of the world we happen to find ourselves. Why should not Africa have a navy? Why should not Africa have a standing army? Why should not Africa have a government second to none in the world? controlled and dominated by African people. Those are Garvey's words. So he's putting the point to us. The essential point was that African people had to unite and organize on the basis of their Africanness to achieve the common purpose of African liberation. Now, what I'll do is I'll read there's a small section here which brings 2.7 to a close. So let me read on. 2.72 is entitled African Liberation in the Broader Revolutionary Movement. And it reads, "The race consciousness of Garvey was always forcefully expressed, but his class consciousness was subtly ever present in his anti-imperialism. During the 1920 UNIA convention, for instance, he placed the African liberation struggle in the broader context of the brotherhood of man." Here's a quote from Garvey. He says, This is an age that is causing all men to feel that they are entitled to liberty and freedom. We are not selfish in our desire for freedom. We know that there are many other peoples that are suffering just as we are suffering. We are in sympathy with the great Irish people who have been overrun for the last 700 years by the tyrants of Britain. We are in sympathy with the people of India, with a population of 380 million who are dominated by Britain. We are in sympathy with the Chinese, the Egyptians, but one and all we are in sympathy with ourselves. And we shall so unite our forces that within the next decade we shall find ourselves a free people and a great people too. Those were the words of Garvey. So Garvey is showing us that he is in sympathy with the struggles of other oppressed people in the world. This was the basis upon which he could work in solidarity with some of the other groups there that were mentioned. But that is not instead of, that is in addition to the work that we have to do as an African people. Our first task is to organize ourselves. It's not to organize other people. Our first task is our own self-determination. And, whatever spare capacity we have, we can link with others. There is a value in making links with other people who face the same enemy as you. Because basically it means you can punch from different angles. And it makes the fight an easier fight to win. If they've got more enemies to worry about, and if those enemies are coordinated, then the extent to which you have to exert yourself in order to achieve your objective can potentially be reduced. Now, continuing, though he was for the freedom of the whole of humanity, Garvey's focus was on African liberation. Other oppressed people were confronting imperialism on their respective fronts, and it was the duty of African people to contribute to the struggle against imperialism by doing so on their own front. He was building an intercontinental or Pan-Africanist organization centered on Africa that would be willing to fight to the death to achieve African self-determination. For Garvey, the liberation of Africa meant that African people at home would live their lives in an environment of self-government with unfettered liberty, freedom, political freedom and democracy. African people who chose to live in foreign lands would have the protection of their powerfully organized African government at home. So, with that point made, let's do a quick musical interlude. I think we've possibly just got a little bit of time left where we can do another musical interlude.
Some people think say God, but it's not God. It's still a God, institutionally, physically, mentally. Hey, still a God all over, it's still a God. Racism exists in a many forms. Still a God in England, it's still a God. Racism, yo. Still a God all over, it's still a God. Racism exists in a many forms.
Come we go, Maccabee with racism.
Racism, hey, it's institutional, it's in the institution. Talking it straight so there is no confusion. We still have face this a racist pollution. Seems like it's written in the constitution. Many people face discrimination. Barriers put up in many organizations. Years of hard work, me say years of devotion. And you never once get promotion, no. Still a one all over, it's still a one. Racism exists in a many forms. Still a one in England, it's still a one. Racism, hey, me say the police in England, them have to admit that X amount of racists, they in it. Murder, commit and racist. Get a quick look on Stephen. How them coulda get away with it? Also exists in the health service. When it comes to black mental health, they are taking them to put up bumpers up with drugs. Man at this, them at this. And you might get suffocated anyhow. You resist investigating the judges. Hear what them fight. If a black man and a white man commit the same crime, the black man's more likely to be doing some time, while the white man might get a fine. Still a guan all over, it's still a guan. Racism exists in a many forms. Still a guan in England, it's still a guan. Racism, yo. Still a guan all over, it's still a guan. Racism exists in a many forms. Still a guan in England, it's still a guan. Racism, yo. A lot of TV presenters but not program makers. No leading characters for the British black actors. In the army, in the navy, in the music as well. When a white man sound black, them always sell. We're definitely not stupid and we're surely not fools. Everybody knows something not right in the schools. I'm not saying every black youth abides by the rules, but we used to being used like tools. The amount of black youth being expelled is really excessive. Always the excuse they were being aggressive, just for being themselves, just for being expressive. The system is just too oppressive, Lord. Still a guan all over, it's still a guan. Racism exists in a many forms. Still a guan in England, it's still a guan. Racism, hey. You want to see we in the European airport. You want to see them face when them see we passport. Them put it on the light, them check the number them too. And the people in front of with them gone straight through. Inna the court, it inna the sport. It in a football, no black players, but not a lot of coaches at all. On the pitch, the black players have to really stand tall. You want to hear the names them get called?
Yes, Racism by Maccabee. And we're on the last lap now. And I think what I'll do for the last lap is just let's just talk a little about the wealth of Africa, because one of the central points of the thesis of Marcus Garvey is that Africa is the richest continent in the world. And it's so rich that everybody wants peace. He talked about, in the quote that I read there, he talked about the white man, he talked about the yellow man. Everybody want peace, and you know the attempts to steal Africa's wealth has become more and more sophisticated right up to the present day. But look, let's just take a step back. Yeah. Africa has more gold than any other continent in the world. Africa has more diamonds than any other continent in the world. Africa has even more chocolate than any other continent in the world. You know, just two nations alone. Just two nations alone, Ghana and Ivory Coast. You know, between them have 70% of the world's cocoa. I think it's more than 70% actually. Yeah, just a little small, a tiny part of Africa. Running things as far as not running things actually, because it's been stolen. We're not dealing with it properly. Yeah, but we produce that much bauxite. You name it. I mean, you name it. You cannot make nuclear weapons without the uranium from Africa's soil. So when you hear India and Pakistan have nuclear weapons, where do they get it from? They haven't got it in their soil. They had to do dodgy deals with corrupt African leaders in order to get hold of the ingredients in order to make those nuclear weapons. Our mobile phones, the Coltran that goes to make up mobile phones, goes to make up computer, got to make, you name it. Yeah, all of that stuff. We have, you know, the largest reserves in the world of all of that stuff and more. But it's one thing to talk about the mineral wealth of Africa. Yeah, 30% of more than 30% of the mineral wealth of Africa of the world is in Africa. Yeah, it's one thing to talk about that wealth, but you know, the United Nations conducted a survey, and in that survey, they examined Ghana, and they were trying to work out how many different edible plants there were in Ghana. At the same time, they conducted a survey for North America, the whole of North America, to work out how many edible plants there were in North America. And they also did the same in India. So, when they did North America, they found, you know, North America, Canada, USA, and Mexico, they found that there were 1,000 different plant varieties in North America. And when they checked India, they found that there were 2,000. Sorry, what am I talking about? There were 1,100 different edible plant varieties in India. And then when they checked Ghana, they found that there were 2,500 different edible plant varieties. Let me just give the significance of that. North America is a continent. India is a subcontinent. You get all the plants you can out of North America, all the plants you can out of India, a continent and a subcontinent, you put them together, and it comes to less than one of the smallest parts of Africa. Ghana is a very small part of Africa. It's only about the size of Britain. It's just a tiny, tiny part of Africa. Yeah? So what we're saying is the wealth in the soil of Africa, just from the point of view of food now, yeah, we have a capacity to feed the world in a way that nowhere else has. And you must remember that Ghana is just a poor part of Africa in those terms. The richest part of Africa is actually the Congo. They probably can't even count up how many different edible plants you have in the Congo. It's so much. So Africa is the wealth of the world that feeds, that has the potential to feed the whole world. When they tell you about famine in Africa and all these kind of things, you know it's contrived. Yeah. Then there's the next issue. If you want to know where the richest place in the world is, look and see how many different animals there are. Which continent has the most animals? The most variety of animals? Then the most? It's Africa, of course, and not even by a margin. By a mile, Africa is the richest continent in the world by miles. I could go on for a long time more, but I have to show some respect to my brother, my brother, Astamari, who is here getting ready to do his program. But the point is this: that Africa is the richest continent in the world. It's not marginally richer than all the other places. It is massively richer. And this is why they're all running at Africa, trying to grab what they can. Take this, take that, take this, take that. And all the thieving that they're doing, there was a recent report which said that they haven't even got to 10% of the wealth. All the thieving that they're doing for us, they haven't even got 10% of what is in our soil out. That's their estimates. Yeah. So let us clear the path now for our brother Astamari to come and make his contribution. It just remains for me to say my goodbyes. I want to say a big thank you. I want to say a big thank you to all of the I just want to say a big thank you to all of the sisters and brothers that listened to the program today. I want to say a special thank you to our sister who rang in and participated in the libation corner today. Thank you for sharing your family's experience with us as a community. Thank you, my sister. I want to say thank you to my fellow presenters here on Blessed Radio. Of course, my brother Astamari, who's coming up shortly. I want to say thank you to the engineers who are in the background, doing tremendous work, making sure that everything comes through loud and clear over the internet. I want to say a special thank you to our station's management for all the work that they are doing in the background, much sometimes taken for granted. But most of all, I want to say a big thank you to my ancestors, without whom none of us would be here today. Asheo.
Wasiye ngikomo zobaba zemu